Welcome back. You're on the money with me, Liam Halligan, on GBNews TV and DAB Plus digital radio. Now, the West's imposed a series of harsh sanctions on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, not least cutting off a number of Russian banks from the international payment system known as SWIFT. But these sanctions could have damaging repercussions here, as Russia could instigate cyber attacks, security sources warn, or they could worsen the energy crisis by cutting off oil and gas supplies to Western Europe. What does all this mean for you at home? Well, from Pickering in North Yorkshire, we have Lorraine Allanson, and she is a pro-fracking campaigner. Lorraine, great to have you on the show. We spoke to Francis Egan at the top of On the Money today. He is the CEO of Quadrilla, as you know. What's your thoughts on that moratorium that the government imposed just a couple of years ago on fracking?
It needs to be lifted straight away. We need to crack on with this fracking because we're now very vulnerable. You know, there's three most important things for any government is defence of the realm, energy and food security. And our government is failing on all three issues of those. So the fracking, we need to get on because it takes a while to appraise what's below the surface and everything. And there was such a lot of propaganda used against shale gas, which was just nonsense. It was a made-up, as I say, it was propaganda. And there is talk that actually Putin funded the anti-fracking movement to the amount of 60 million in Europe. And even NATO, years ago, warned Europe that Putin was tampering with the anti-fracking movement, encouraging them and funding them. You know, they could foresee what would happen. And what we need is energy security. I cannot believe that we are closing, plugging and abandoning the wells over at PNR in Lancashire, and they are pushing the Oil and Gas Authority to abandon our onshore oil and gas industry that is conventional as well. And when I looked, I thought, why are they doing this? They're supposed to be the regulators of the industry and to ensure that we do have a good, secure supply. But when you look at their remit, our government has told them to reach net zero. Well, net zero will mean that we have no energy security, no oil and gas of our own, and we'll only end up, you know, importing from dubious regimes and at much higher cost to the planet, due to the having to degasify and then regasify gas when it comes across in tankers, and rely on people like Putin, who is a loose cannon completely now. Would you trust him? I certainly wouldn't. And fuel poverty will escalate. It's going to be dreadful. You know, I find that a lot of the eco-warriors are very wealthy. But what about all the ordinary people who are poor? They need support. They need affordable energy. Can you imagine if you're on the breadline now and your electricity and your gas is doubling in price? How on earth are you going to afford to survive? So yes, let's get cracking, let's get fracking.
Gareth Stace, turning to you. You represent UK steel industry, employs tens of thousands of people, still a major employer in this country, and of course we need steel for all kinds of things. What's your stance on fracking?
Well, from our point of view, as the steel sector in the UK, we would like to see more stable energy markets. At the moment, since September, perhaps, the electricity price has been up and down in the day, in the night, and it's been very difficult for us to plan production. So what we want to see is more energy security, which would lead to more stable prices. But what we really want government to do here is address the uncompetitive electricity prices that we're paying here in the UK that our competitors aren't paying. And in the last few days, we've seen those electricity prices go up against the gas price going up. And
a lot of manufacturers, even some steel makers, your bills are higher, aren't they? Because you have the renewable obligation. I know there's some exceptions for some very energy-intensive steel users, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the round, UK manufacturers, UK heavy industry, of which you're part, their electricity bills are higher, aren't they? Because they must add on to their bills subsidies that then go to the renewable energy sector. Is that right at a time like now?
We would say not. If we look at, say, steel producers in Germany, they don't pay those costs. The government recognises they need a competitive business landscape. Here in the UK, as you said, Liam, carbon costs, but it's not just carbon costs, it's energy tax costs, the carbon costs, the transmission costs, the distribution costs. They are loaded onto us as high energy users, not fairly, like literally, who's going to pay for them? The steel sector can pay for them. And that
But you're trying to compete internationally, right?
Yeah, steel is a globally traded commodity.
Let's turn to you, Vicky Price. You're very experienced when it comes to economic policy making in Whitehall, if I may say so. To what extent do you think this Russia-Ukraine conflict and the broader East-West conflict, an economic war, if you like, is it going to spark a wholesale rethink in UK energy policy when it comes to nuclear, when it comes to gas storage, when it comes to fracking, when it comes to those renewable subsidies that are loaded on, not just to households, but also to companies?
I think it may well do so, but of course renewable subsidies or renewable payments, if you like, are still needed because they will be part of the overall energy security. Because we will be producing energy in the UK, which will come straight into the grid. So we've got to bear in mind that this is going to be part of the mix.
From wind farms and solar and all the rest of it.
That will be part of the mix. There's no doubt about that. But there is an issue about the transition in particular. And I think until recently, the cost of the transition was underestimated.
To net zero.
To net zero.
Yeah.
I think there were loads of people who thought we could just do it without gas, without anything. But we now know full well that the wind doesn't always blow and you absolutely need the rest to be there for quite some time, and therefore we need gas more. Now the question is, how can we get ourselves off this international very high price that's there now? And no, we can't necessarily, but we're not dependent on Russia as much as others in Europe because we get any imports we get mostly from Norway. And there is, of course, a possibility that other producers will be prepared to give more in the short term, but we do need gas here in this country.
Of course, Norway is very important, but what's happening in Russia affects gas prices, which then affect us. So, Lorraine Allanson, let's go back to you. How do you feel when you see the people that you call eco-warriors campaigning outside Downing Street, campaigning in town centres that they don't want fracking? What's your message to them?
They actually need to start thinking about the general population because they have very strong views and but they are well funded. I mean, you're showing signs there of Friends of the Earth. They have big green NGOs behind them, and they have a motive of their own. They have their own agenda. You've got Socialist Worker backs a lot of these groups, and their agenda. I mean, there was lots of Marxists actually campaigning in our area, but they were stopping us developing our own industry, and they're not actually benefiting the planet with their ideas of stopping us producing, because all we're going to do is import instead, because we're not going to stop using gas or oil, you know, for decades and decades. And it's a farce to rely on imports. So I'd like them to go away and think about what they're doing, because not only are they stopping our industry, and I think they like to think they're hitting big companies, they're hitting the poor people at the bottom of our country who are living on the edge of poverty all the time. And we need to be sensible about this. I find there's nothing sensible happening with politicians. They're not thinking straight. In fact, a lot of them are energy illiterate. You know, you've got to look after our own people and get their energy costs down, and the only way we can do that is to produce it ourselves. And renewables may be part of the mix, but they'll never be 100% of the mix, and you can't develop and build renewables without oil and gas. People fail to remember that.
Gareth Stace of UK Steel, I always know from 25, 30 years in journalism, the public's always ahead of the politicians. The public often tells the experts what's really going on, with all respect. You've just heard from Lorraine Allanson there. Her and many people like her are developing a real understanding and knowledge of the energy complex. Would UK Steel back Labour's idea of a windfall tax on these huge energy companies, not least British energy companies, making enormous profits at a time when our energy security is under threat and ordinary households are really feeling the squeeze?
Well, what we'd back as the steel sector in the UK is any moves from government that would bring down the cost of electricity and gas for us, that isn't loading the costs of carbon and energy taxes onto us as a steel sector. So it's basically, you know, is this government behind a strategically important sector?
Including a windfall tax? If the big energy companies, they're making tens of billions of pounds in profit, they can pay the renewable subsidies that your members are paying. They can pay them for now, at a time when there's this global energy crunch.
But what government needs to do is look at the long-term policy and the policy direction and say, do we want competitive energy markets in the UK? If we do, then there's more to do than just a windfall tax, because we need to look for the longer term here. Because that's in the steel sector. You invest. You don't invest for tomorrow or next month. You invest for the very long term. It's a massively cash-intensive sector, the steel sector is.
And of course, steel, British steel is important for British defence, right?
Oh, at times of war and conflict like this, it makes you realise how vital and strategically vital a sector like steel is to the UK economy. So, if this conflict went on much longer, and we were looking at, can we in the UK supply all of the steel that the UK economy needs, including for defence purposes, my fear, my concern is the answer would be no, we couldn't. And that's not a good place to be in as a little island that's now outside of Europe that does need to think strategic and think about sustainable and being self-sustaining.
Gareth Stace, Chief Executive of UK Steel, the Trade Association. Vicky Price, of course, friend of the show. Chief Economist at the Centre for Economic and Business Research. And GB News viewer Lorraine Allanson, pro-fracking campaigner, I should say, from Yorkshire. Thanks all for joining me. A fascinating and important discussion. Lots of you getting in touch with your views and concerns on whether the conflict in Ukraine with Russia will worsen the UK's energy crisis. Devon says, surely it's time to rethink British energy policy. We should be using home sources such as nuclear, fracking and North Sea oil, much more to keep the cost of fuel down and ensure energy supply security as we transition to a more secure, dependable and possibly greener sources of energy in the future. On whether we should reintroduce fracking, John says, those tremors were insignificant. This anti-fracking position is unscientific and demonstrates, says John, weak surrender. But Joan disagrees with John. She says we shouldn't use fracking.